I first started thinking about improvisation back in the 1990s. I wrote an article in 1993 called In Garden and the Problem of Jazz. And that was because I was working on music and improvisation, and I came to realize that the current paradigm, which was a paradigm in which the way in which it was thought that composing and performing worked was the composer would compose something, and the performer would then perform exactly what the composer had stated. And I came to realize that for jazz this simply didn't work. As a jazz improviser, you create something in the moment. But then as I thought more about it, I came to realize, but this doesn't work even for classical music. Because as a classical musician, I'm not simply repeating something, I'm actually saying something new. I'm repeating what the composer has asked me to repeat, but I'm adding something from myself. So I came to realize that this improvisational model that I'm putting forward in this book actually did a better job of explaining what it is that we as artists do. The old model, of course, before In Garden, is that of Kant, which goes back to 1790, his Critique of Judgment. And in the Critique of Judgment, Kant talks about the artist as a genius. The genius creates out of nothing, in a kind of godlike sort of fashion. It's as if the genius creates ex nihilo, the way God created the world. And so Kant puts forward this idea as this norm for the way artists create. And what I argue in my book is that norm, in fact, is not the way artists create, that we're actually improvisers. And we improvise in a sense that we take part of, we take what other people have created and we work with that, and then we add our own elements to that. As I said, I first started thinking about improvisation back in the 1990s, and it was at that time that I was able to study with Hans-Georg Gadamer. At that time, Gadamer was the most important living German philosopher. And I got to know Gadamer, and we became friends. And he was really the first person to see some of my early work on improvisation, in which I was arguing for the idea that we as artists are really improvisers. And Gadamer was very encouraging. First, when I talked about this, he didn't really understand what I was talking about. But as I explained how improvisation works, that you start with certain kind of rules, and there are certain ways of improvising, certain expectations for what one does as an improviser, he came to see that indeed I was correct in what I was arguing. But of course I would have never come to this place of understanding improvisation in this way if it hadn't been for Gadamer. So in many ways, what I'm doing is translating the kinds of thoughts that one finds in Gadamer's Truth and Method and various other texts into a kind of improvisational model, and then arguing for that model as a way to rethink what happens when we create art to replace the Kantian model. Now, I'm also very influenced in my work by Jean-Louis Chrétien. Chrétien is a French philosopher who's still alive, a Christian, and really a fascinating writer. And what I get from Chrétien is primarily his emphasis on the call and response. The call and response structure, once you've seen it, you realize is everywhere. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, God says, "Let there be light." And that's the call, and the response is, "There is light." Then in Genesis chapter 22, Abraham is called by God. God says, "Abraham, Abraham," and Abraham responds, "Here am I, Hineni," which means I'm at your disposal. I'm ready to do what you command. And once you notice the structure, you realize that it's all over Scripture. So it goes on over and over. So Moses is called by the burning bush. It's God, of course. And Moses says, "Lord, here I am." And so you find this structure over and over again. And so what I do in my book is say, this is a kind of basic structure that helps us understand exactly what it is that we do, and helps us understand what it is to live our lives. We are beings who are called into existence by God, and then we in turn call out to others. And so the call and the response structure is basic to human life.